Welcome to Western Whispers, a Washington State historical fiction novel. Written by Ken Cannon. Narrated by Richard Pulsifer. Copyright 2023 by BrooksAudiobooks.com and Shadowplay Communications, LLC. All rights reserved. No portion of this book may be reproduced in any form without written permission from the publisher or author. Visit BrooksAudiobooks.com for updates on the availability of new books and a special free offer. Chapter 1. As June drew to a close, the vast wheat fields of the Northwest took on a golden hue, adding a stark beauty to the rolling hills that stretched as far as the eye could see. These hills were devoid of trees, and the land alternated between fallow ground and waving grain, leading up to the isolated homes of the brave men who had tamed the harsh environment of sage and sand. These homes, simple and unassuming, were mere specks on the horizon, lost amidst the endless expanse of golden and gray billows of land. This was a hard and lonely country where flowers and fruit were scarce, and the only sounds were the whirling strings of dust and the howling wind. The wheat, short and dry, lay back from the relentless gusts, and the distant haze was thick with smoky substance. Here and there a dusty road cut through the hills, disappearing into the horizon. The sun beat down mercilessly, and the shadow that hung over the land was eerie and prophetic, as if waiting for something to happen. The hills, with their shallow valleys, seemed big and strange, and the beauty of them was austere, as if man had held back from making his mark on the land. The immensity of the task had left no room for youth and freshness, and the wheat looked as if it had been there for centuries. This was a land where time moved slowly, and the earth itself seemed ancient. No other wasteland, once the home of other races of man and now fallen to decay and death, could have been so barren and desolate. And yet, amidst all this hardship, the heroic men who had conquered this land had found a way to survive, and to make a life for themselves in this unforgiving place. The vast expanse of land before me was a patchwork of squares, half of which were brown and gray earth that had been worked tirelessly by calloused hands. The other half held a faint golden promise of a bountiful harvest, shimmering in the hot sun from a long distance away. The scene was a beautiful harmony of long, sloping hills and endless curves, stretching out in all directions. It was a heroic sight, for the labor that had gone into it was immeasurable, yet it was also sublime, for nature's power and ageless beauty could never be taken away. This was the Columbia Basin, a valley of considerable altitude surrounded by mountains on all sides. The Cascade Mountains loomed to the west, while the Coeur d'Alene and Bitterroot Mountains stood guard to the east. The Okanogan Range lay to the north, and the Blue Mountains to the south. The valley floor was made of basalt, a result of ancient volcanic activity. Rainfall was scarce, except in the foothills of the mountains. The Columbia River bordered three sides of the Bend country, as the area was known, making a prodigious and meandering curve. South of this region, across the mountain range, lay the fertile, well-watered lands of Oregon. It was strange to think that in this vast, treeless, and waterless desert, the richest and finest wheat in the world was grown. Yet it was so. The staff of life, the hope of civilization, came from this dreary desert. The little towns scattered among the hills of the Bend country were evidence of the mixed population that had come to work the land and make it their own. The country was flourishing, evidenced by the bustling towns and vast farms that ranged from 640 acres to thousands. On an early July morning, a young farmer named Stan Arquette left his father's presence with a troubled expression. They had just had a heated argument, and Stan had promised to give up his desire to join the army. As he leaned on the fence, he noticed a motor car in the distance, kicking up a trail of dust. Stan assumed it was Mr. Smith, the wealthy rancher, who was coming to inspect his father's wheat fields. Stan despised the debt that his father owed to Smith, and he resented the rancher's visit. However, he couldn't deny that Smith had been lenient and kind to his father over the years. Stan knew that his father was illiterate, harsh, and growing more difficult with age. He surveyed the vast wheat field and hoped for rain, but the cloudless sky and the heat indicated that a drought would persist. As the motor car approached, Stan's face grew darker with worry. The big, dusty car came to a stop in front of the house, and the rancher stepped out. The driver pulled up to the gate and stepped out of the car. "Is this Bert Arquette's farm?" he inquired. "Yes," replied Stan. A short, stout man in a long linen coat emerged from the car after him. "Come out, Marcia, and shake off the dust," he said, helping a young woman out of the car. She was also wearing a long linen coat and a veil. The man took off his coat and threw it into the car, then removed his sombrero to brush off the dust. "Phew, the Golden Valley has never seen dust like this in a million years. I'm parched for water. And listen to the car, it's boiling," he exclaimed. As he approached Stan, the rancher revealed himself to be a well-preserved man of about 55 years old with a powerful build that was beginning to sag in his broad shoulders. His face was bronzed from long exposure to wind and sun, and he had sharp gray eyes that reflected his familiarity with and goodwill towards those he dealt with. "Hello, are you young Arquette?" he asked. "Yes, sir," replied Stan, stepping forward. "I'm Smith from Triton, come to see your dad. This is my girl Marcia." Stan acknowledged the veiled young woman's slight bow and then hesitated before asking, "Won't you come in?" "No, not yet. I'm parched for air and water. Bring us a drink," replied Smith. Stan hurried off to get a bucket and a tin cup. As he drew water from the well, he found himself vaguely embarrassed by the fact that Mr. Smith was accompanied by his daughter. Stan was afraid of his father, but what did it matter? When he returned to the yard, he found the rancher sitting in the shade of one of the few apple trees while the young lady was standing nearby, removing her bonnet and veil. The girl had casually tossed her linen coat over an old wagon bed that was nearby. "Water's hard to come by around here, but I'm grateful we have some," Stan said, setting down the bucket and offering a cup to the girl. As he handed it to her, he caught a glimpse of her face, and their eyes met. He fumbled, dropping the cup and spilling its contents. "Sorry, I'm clumsy," he stammered, quickly refilling the cup and handing it to her with his eyes averted. For over a year, memories of this girl had lingered in his mind. He had seen her twice before, once during his last year at the University of California and again on the streets of Spokane. In an instant he had recognized her lithe frame, her sunny hair, her rare golden complexion, and her warm, direct blue eyes. He had been momentarily stunned. "That's good water, isn't it?" Smith interjected after taking a second cupful. "But it's not the best drinking water. Come down to the foothills and I'll show you. My ranch is called Many Waters, and you can't keep your feet dry." "I wish we had some of that here," Stan replied, gesturing towards the broad rolling hills. The warm breeze blowing in from the wheat fields felt dry and smelled dry. "You're in for a dry spell?" Smith asked with keen interest and kindness. "My father says so, and I'm afraid too because he never makes a mistake when it comes to weather or crops," Stan replied. "A hot, dry spell this summer? Boy, do you know that wheat is the most important thing in the world today?" Smith exclaimed. "You mean because of the war?" Stan answered. "Yes, I know, but my father doesn't see that. All he sees is that if we have rain, we'll have bumper crops." "That field over there could break records in war prices," said Smith, eyeing the wheat, "and you won't go bankrupt." "Bankrupt?" Arquette repeated, confused. "Oh, you mean I'd have to close down? Say, what happens if it rains during a big wheat yield?" "Mr. Smith, I want to pay off our debt, but I'm thinking more about the wheat for the starving people. I've studied this wheat question. It's the biggest issue in this war," said Arquette, forgetting about the girl who had been watching him intently. Smith became more interested in the wheat and in Arquette himself. "How old are you?" he asked. 25, and my name is Stan," replied Arquette. "Will this farm be passed down to you?" Smith inquired. "Yes, if my father doesn't lose it," said Arquette. "Well, don't worry, old Arquette won't lose it. He grows the best wheat in this area," Smith reassured him. "But my father never owned the land. We've had 3 bad years. If the wheat fails this summer, we'll lose everything," Arquette explained. "Are you American?" Smith asked cautiously. "I am," snapped Arquette. "My mother was American. She's dead. My father is German. He's old and he's become rabid since the president declared war. He'll never change." "That's a tough situation. What will you do if your country calls you to fight?" Smith asked. "I'll go," Arquette exclaimed with determination. "I wanted to enlist, but my father and I fought about it until I had to give in. He's impossible. I'll wait for the draft and hope I'm called." That's the spirit Germany has roused, and the best I can say is God help her. Do you have a brother? Smith asked. No, I'm all my father has, Arquette replied. Well, it's a tough situation for both of you. Humor him. He's old. And when you're called, go and fight. You'll come back, Smith advised. If only I knew it wouldn't be so hard, Arquette sighed. It sure is hard, but it'll make a great country. It'll weed out the riffraff, Smith said with conviction. Listen up, Stan, said Smith. I'm about to give you a heads up. Have you had any dealings with the IWW? Yeah, last harvest we had some trouble, but nothing too serious. When I was in Spokane last month, I heard a lot about them. Strangers have been approaching us here too, mostly aliens. I don't like them, but they always manage to get my father's attention. And now, to be honest, I'm worried, replied Stan. You should be, replied Smith earnestly. We're all worried. I'm going to let you read over the laws of that IWW organization. You have to keep quiet about this, though. I belong to the Chamber of Commerce in Spokane. Someone managed to get hold of these bylaws of this so-called labor union. We've made copies, and every honest farmer in the Northwest is going to read them, but carrying one around these days is dangerous. Here. Smith hesitated for a moment, looked around cautiously, and then slipped folded sheets of paper from his inside coat pocket. He was clearly ready to hand them over to Stan. Marcia, where's the driver? He asked. He's under the car, replied the girl. Stan was thrilled to hear her voice. He had been haunted by her face for a year, and it was something to finally hear her speak. He's new to me, that driver, and I don't trust any new men these days, continued Smith. Here, Arquette, read that, and if you don't get angry— Without finishing his last muttered remark, he opened the sheets of manuscript and spread them out for Stan. Curiously, with a little rush of excitement, Stan began to read. The very first rule of the IWW aimed to abolish capital. Stan read on with slowly growing amazement, consternation, and anger. When he had finished, his look was a speechless question, which Smith hastened to answer. It's the real deal, he declared. Those are the actual rules of that gang. We made sure before we acted. Well, what do you think of them? Asked Stan. That ain't no damn labor union, exclaimed Stan, getting worked up. They're nothing but a bunch of outlaws, thieves, blackmailers, and pirates. I don't know what the hell they are. Arquette, we're in trouble here. There's trouble brewing in Montana and Idaho, and strangers are coming in from all over Washington. We need to organize and prevent them from getting a foothold here. It's mostly aliens in this so-called labor union with dishonest and unscrupulous leaders, some of them American. They're trying to take advantage of the war situation. They talk about shorter hours, more pay, and union recognition in the newspapers. But if you read the laws I showed you, you'd see that the IWW is crooked. Mr. Smith, what have you done in your area? Asked Stan. I've hired my workers for a year, paid them high wages, and warned them to be polite and feed strangers who come around, replied Smith. But we can't do that here in the Bend, said Arquette seriously. We need at least 100,000 men during harvest time, but only 10,000 for the rest of the year. You can't do that here, agreed Smith. But you need to organize something. If that outfit gets here and grows strong enough, you'll have a lot of trouble. Tell every farmer you trust about the IWW. I only have one American neighbor 6 miles away, said Arquette. Olson over there is a Swede and not a citizen, but I think he's on the side of the U.S. Dad, interrupted the girl, our driver is listening to your very dull conversation. She spoke with a laugh in her voice, and Arquette dared to look at her. He met her blue eyes, but they quickly looked away. Smith growled some hard words under his breath, but his Western spirit shone through in his eyes. Marcia, I think you'll have more to say than me, said the man, getting up. I'll go see Arquette and get this business over with. I'd rather go with you, Stan quickly replied. Then, realizing his mistake, he blushed and stuttered. I don't mean that. But my father is in a bad mood. We just quarreled. I told you about the war. And Mr. Smith, I'm a little afraid he'll— Well, son, I'm not afraid, interrupted the rancher. I'll face the old lion in his den. You talk to Marcia. Please don't speak of the war, Stan pleaded. Not a word unless he starts roaring at Uncle Sam, declared Smith with a twinkle in his eye, and turned toward the house. He'll roar all right, said Stan with a groan. He knew what was coming, and he hated that it couldn't be avoided. Stan was confused, astounded, and infuriated with himself over a situation he had not brought about and could scarcely realize. He became conscious of pride and shame, and something as black and hopeless as despair. "Haven't I seen you before?" asked the girl. The question surprised and thrilled Stan out of his self-centered thought. "I don't know. Have you? Where?" he answered, facing her. It was a relief to find that she still averted her face. "At Berkeley in California the first time, and the second at Spokane in front of the Davenport," she replied. "First and second? You remembered both times," he burst out incredulously. "Yes, I don't see how I could have helped remembering." Her laugh was low, musical, a little hurried, yet cool. Arquette was not familiar with girls. He had worked hard all his life there among those desert hills, and during the few years his father had allowed him for education. He knew wheat, but nothing of the eternal feminine. It was impossible for Stan to ignore the fact that the girl before him was not entirely comfortable. Her words and her casual laugh made it clear that there was a significant gap between him and a daughter of one of the wealthiest ranchers in Washington. "So I was being impolite," he began, struggling between embarrassment and pride. "I was staring at you. I must have been rude. But, Miss Smith, I didn't mean to be. I didn't think you even saw me. I'm not sure why I did it. It's never happened before. I apologize." Arquette noticed a subtle, indescribable shift in the girl's demeanor, even in his confused state. "I didn't say you were impolite," she replied. "I just remembered noticing you noticing me." Self-assured, detached, and kind, Miss Smith became an enigma to Arquette. But this only emphasized the distance she had alluded to between them. Her kindness made him want to regain his composure. He wished she hadn't been so kind. What a strange coincidence that she was now in his home, the daughter of a man who had come to demand a long-overdue debt. It was a stark reminder that his vague dreams were far from reality. Arquette gazed across the yellowing hills to the faint blue of the mountains where the Oregon River flowed. Despite the color, it looked gray, much like his future. "I heard you telling my father that you've studied wheat," said the girl, attempting to start a conversation. "Yes, my whole life," replied Stan. "Mostly under my father's guidance. Look at my hands." He held out his large, scarred, and calloused hands, palms facing up, and chuckled. "I'm proud of them, Miss Smith. But I also had a great year at the university in California, and I graduated from Washington State Agricultural College." "Do you love raising wheat?" she asked. The beauty of wheat, from the clean, plump grain to the deep, waving fields of gold, was something that Stan couldn't help but love. He had even worked in a Spokane flour mill to learn how flour was made, and he knew that nothing in the world was as white, clean, and pure as flour made from the wheat of those hills. As he talked with the girl, he proudly admitted that he could bake all the bread they used, and he could beat any girl she knew at it. She laughed softly and told him that her own bread used to be pretty good before she went to college, but now her family made fun of it. When she mentioned her brother, Stan suddenly felt a connection with her. He learned that her brother Jim had enlisted in the war instead of waiting for the draft, and her mother would be devastated if anything happened to him. Stan sympathized with her, but he couldn't help but mention that his own father was German. The need for war was horrible, and the thought of losing loved ones was unbearable. But for now, Stan and the girl were simply two people talking about bread and wheat, enjoying each other's company on a warm summer day. "He's been in America for 50 years, but he's been on this farm for 18. He never liked England, but now he's bitter towards America," said the young man to the girl beside him. "I understand where you're coming from, but I don't blame you for your feelings," replied the girl sympathetically. "Thanks for understanding. It's hard to be in this situation," said the young man. "I'll tell my father that I have no choice but to join the army, but I'll be fighting against his people. It's like our house is divided against itself," he continued. The girl sighed sadly. Before they could say anything more, they heard a step behind them. Mr. Smith appeared, his sombrero off and his face red with anger. "Stan, your old man is a son of a gun," exclaimed Mr. Smith loudly. "I tried to reason with him, but he called me a lot of things in German and told me I was a capitalist and an enemy to labor. He even said that me and my kind caused the war." Stan looked gravely at Mr. Smith while the girl watched wide-eyed in wonder. "But that's not all," continued Mr. Smith. "He ordered me out of the house, and when I refused, he pulled my nose and called me a bloody Englishman." Stan groaned in embarrassment, but the girl burst out laughing. "Oh, Dad, that's just too good for anything. You finally met your match. The tension in the air dissipated as they all laughed together. "You always talk about your English ancestry," teased the girl, noticing the man's nose. "He's got to be over 70, grumbled Smith, searching for an excuse to justify his restraint. "I'm angry, but it's still funny." His face finally broke into a large laugh, causing young Arquette to struggle to contain his own mirth. But when he looked at the girl's sparkling blue eyes, brimming with youth and joy, he couldn't help but join in the laughter. "The joke's on me," admitted Smith, "but I can take it. Now, young man, your father mentioned that if the wheat crop was successful, I'd get my money. Otherwise, I could take over the land. Personally, I wouldn't do that, but the other investors might, even for the small amount of money involved. I tried to buy them out to take over the whole mortgage, but they refused to sell." "You're an honest man, Mr. Smith, and I'll do it," declared Stan. "Let's go see the wheat," interrupted Smith. "Marcia, do you want to come with us?" "I do," replied the daughter, putting on her hat. Stan led them through the yard and past the old barn to the edge of the open slope. The wheat fields stretched out before them up and down as far as the eye could see. Chapter 2. We got more than 1,600 acres of land lying fallow, with a half section planted with rye, another half with turkey red wheat, and this section here, 640 acres, all covered in blue stem, Stan declared. Smith's sharp gaze scanned from up close to afar, taking in the rolling hills and the distant slopes. The wheat had grown to 2 feet high, its heads thick and heavy, as if fighting to break free. The soft summer breeze carried a fragrant scent of dry wheat mixed with dust, and a faint rustle of silken leaves. As they approached the vast wheat field, the greenish color near them gradually transformed into lighter shades of yellow and gold in the distance. The field seemed to possess a living spirit. "Arquette, this is the finest wheat I've seen," exclaimed Smith in admiration. "Actually, it's the only good field of wheat we've seen since we left the foothills." "How is that?" "Late spring and dry weather," replied Arquette. "Most farmers' reports are poor. If it rains over the Bend country, we'll have an average yield this year. If it doesn't rain, then it's a flat failure." Miss Smith became interested in the topic and wanted to know why this particular field, which looked identical to the others for miles around, had the promise of a magnificent crop when the others did not. "This section lay fallow for a long time," explained Arquette. "Snow lasted here on this north slope for quite a while. My father used a soil cultivation method designed to conserve moisture. The seed wheat was specially selected. And if we get rain during the next 10 days, this section of blue stem will yield 50 bushels to the acre." "50 bushels?" exclaimed Smith. "Blue stem? Why do you call it that when it's green and yellow?" queried the girl. "It's a name. There are many varieties of wheat. Blue stem is the best here in this desert country because it resists drought, produces a large yield, doesn't break, and is rated very high by flour mills. Blue stem doesn't do well in wet soils." Smith walked along the edge of the field, examining the wheat and pulling a shaft here and there. The girl gazed across the undulating sea with dreamy eyes. Arquette watched her. "We have a ranch thousands of acres, but it's not like this," she said. Arquette looked out at the vast expanse of wheat fields and asked, "What's the difference?" Her voice was filled with uncertainty. "I'm not quite sure," he replied. "What would you call this scene?" "I would call it a desert of wheat," she said. "That's not what anyone else calls it," he said. "My father named his ranch Many Waters. I think that name tells the difference." "But isn't my desert beautiful?" she asked. "No, it's too monotonous," he said. "It looks like the whole world has gone to wheat. It's oppressive. All this means is that we live by wheat alone. These bare hills are too open to wind and sun and snow. They look like the toil of ages." "Miss Smith, there is such a thing as love for the earth, the bare brown earth," he said. "We came from dust, and to dust we return. These fields are human to my father, and they have come to speak to me a language I don't understand yet. But I mean what you see. The growing wheat here, the field of clods over there, the wind and dust and glare and heat, the eternal sameness of the open space. These are the things around which my life is centered, and when I go away from them I am not content." Smith returned to the young couple, carrying some heads of wheat in his hand. "Smut," he exclaimed, showing both diseased and healthy specimens of wheat. "Had to hunt hard to find that. Smut is the bane of all wheat growers. I never saw so little of it as there is here. In fact, we know scarcely nothing about smut and its cure, if there is any. You farmers who raise only grain have got the work down to a science. This blue stem is not bearded wheat like turkey red. Has that beard anything to do with smut? I think not. The parasite or fungus lives inside the wheat, he said. Never heard that before. No wonder smut is the worst trouble for wheat raisers in the Northwest. I've fields literally full of smut. Farmers never seem to be able to agree on anything. One farmer has one idea and another has a completely different one. But what could be more important to a farmer, especially now with the war going on? The experts say that wheat is going to be the key to winning the war, but we're losing millions of bushels because of this smut. It's a terrible fact to face. Arquette couldn't help but glance over at Miss Smith. He noticed curiosity, interest, and something more in her direct blue eyes. He felt a bit embarrassed, but also excited. He loved talking about wheat, but he didn't want to bore her. But she didn't seem bored at all. In fact, she seemed genuinely interested. Smith, who had his hand affectionately on her shoulder, chimed in, "She's a farmer's daughter. She'll be a farmer's wife." Everyone laughed, but the girl blushed. Arquette shook his head doubtfully. "I don't think good fortune will ever befall a farmer," he said. But the girl, still blushing, replied, "Well, if it should, just imagine how I might surprise him with my knowledge of wheat." She was clearly interested in what Arquette had to say. Arquette, feeling encouraged, quoted two of his authorities, Heald and Woolman, from the State Agricultural Experiment Station where he had studied for 2 years. Bunt, or stinking smut, is caused by 2 different species of microscopic fungi which live as parasites in the wheat plant, he explained. The effects and life cycle of 2 types of smut fungus, Tilletia tritici and Tilletia feuitans, are essentially the same. Tilletia tritici, which has rough spores, is the common stinking smut in the Pacific regions. Tilletia feuitans, which has smooth spores, is typically found in the eastern United States. Smut balls or berries from an infected head contain countless tiny bodies, known as spores or seeds of the smut fungus. These spores reproduce the smut in a similar way to how a true seed grows into a new plant. A single smut ball of average size has enough spores to give one for each grain of wheat in 5 or 6 bushels. It takes 8 smut spores to equal the diameter of a human hair. Even normal wheat grains from an infected field can have so many spores on their surface that they appear dark in color. Other grains that appear the same as uninfected grains may still have enough spores to produce a smutty crop if seed treatment is not performed. When living smut spores are introduced into the soil with the seed wheat, or if they already exist in the soil where smut-free wheat is planted, a certain percentage of the wheat plants are likely to become infected. The smut spore germinates and produces the first stage of the smut plant in the soil. This first stage does not infect a young seedling directly, but gives rise to secondary spores or sporida, from which infection threads may arise and penetrate the shoot of a young seedling and reach the growing point. The fungus threads keep pace with the growth of the plant and reach maturity at or slightly before harvest time, since this disease is caused by an internal parasite. It is natural to expect certain responses to its presence. Firstly, it's important to acknowledge that the smut fungus feeds off its host plant, which is wheat. Its impact on the host can be summed up as follows: consuming food, destroying food during the sporulation process, and either stimulating or retarding normal physiological processes. Plants badly affected by smut often remain undersized and produce fewer and smaller heads. In the fife and bluestem varieties, infected heads exhibit a darker green color before maturity and remain green longer than normal heads. In some varieties, infected heads remain erect while normal ones begin to droop due to the weight of ripening grain. A crop can become infected with smut in various ways. Smut was initially introduced through seed, and many farmers are still using it to plant their wheat each season. Wheat taken from a smutty crop will have countless loose spores sticking to the grains, along with a certain number of unbroken smut balls. These are always a source of danger, even if the seed is treated with fungicides before sowing. There are also chances for a crop to become infected even if smut-free seed is used. Firstly, soil infection from a previous smutty crop, and secondly, soil infection from wind-blown spores. Experiments have shown that separated spores from crushed smut balls lose their effectiveness in 2 to 3 months, provided that the soil is moist and loose, and in no case do they survive a winter. It's unlikely that wheat smut will be controlled by any one method alone, but rather by the combined use of various methods, such as crop rotation, using clean seed, treating seed with fungicides, cultural practices, breeding, and selecting varieties. The general prevalence of smut in the wheat fields of eastern Washington is likely due to a failure to practice crop rotation. Even if a farmer allows a field to lie fallow during the summer, the smut from a previous crop can still infect the next crop. However, farmers have found that planting a stubble crop in the fall is less likely to get infected with smut compared to planting after a summer fallow. This is because wind-blown spores can infect the summer fallow, while the plowing of a stubble crop buries the wind-blown spores and those from the previous crop. The smut problem could have been avoided if all farmers had used clean or properly treated seed. High percentages of smut indicate either soil infection or imperfect treatment. The chemical treatment involves using a poison that kills the superficial spores of the smut without damaging the seed's germinating power. The hot water treatment is only recommended if the chemical treatment is ineffective. Certain cultural practices can reduce the amount of smut, but their effectiveness depends on the source of the smut spores. The temperature of the soil during the germinating period, the amount of soil moisture, and the depth of seeding are always factors that influence the amount of smut. If seed-borne spores are the only source of infection, then paying attention to these three factors is the only way to reduce the amount of smut. Some farmers have reported a marked reduction in smut by seeding early. Replowing the summer fallow after the first fall rains and planting 4 or 5 weeks after the first good fall rains are also effective practices. Fall tillage of summer fallow, other than plowing, seems to be beneficial. There are no smut-immune varieties of wheat, but standard varieties show varying degrees of resistance. Spring wheats generally suffer less from smut than winter varieties. The reason for the lower rate of infection in certain wheat varieties is not due to their superior resistance, but rather their ability to escape infection. Although planting only spring wheats could solve the smut problem, it is not recommended as winter wheats are more desirable. It is likely that the conditions during the growing season have an impact on the percentage of smut in a particular variety. After finishing his discourse, Arquette and his listeners walked back through the yard towards the road. Suddenly, Mr. Smith, who was leading the way, stopped abruptly and asked, Who are those men talking to my driver?" Arquette noticed 2 strangers speaking closely with the chauffeur next to the motor car. As soon as they saw Mr. Smith approaching, they hurriedly left. Arquette had noticed many suspicious strangers lately whose garb and actions were not typical of farmers. "I bet 100 they're IWWs," declared Smith. "Take my hunch, Arquette." The strangers walked down the road without looking back. "I wonder where they'll sleep tonight," muttered Arquette. Smith asked his driver what the 2 men wanted, and the response was that they were inquiring about work. "Did they speak English?" asked the rancher. "Well enough to make themselves understood," replied the driver. Arquette did not have a good impression of Mr. Smith's man, who seemed to have shifty eyes and a taciturn air. It was clear that the blunt rancher was restraining himself. He helped his daughter into the car, put on his long coat, and shook hands with Arquette. "Young man, I've enjoyed meeting you and have certainly gained from it," he said, "which makes up for your dad. I'll come back here again to see you around harvest time, and I'll be wishing for that rain." "Thank you," replied Arquette. "I'll be happy to see you if it rains," Arquette said with a smile. "But if it doesn't, I won't bother coming. I'll just put it off for another year and convince the others to do the same." "You're too kind," the girl replied. "I don't know how we could ever repay you if that's the case." "Don't mention it. By the way, how far did you say Palmer was? We could stop there for lunch." "It's about 15 miles that way," Arquette answered. "If it weren't for my father, I'd invite you to stay and share some of my food." Arquette couldn't help but notice the girl's steady gaze on him since she entered the car. Her eyes seemed dark, sweet, and thoughtful under the shade of her hat and veil. She nodded her thanks as she held the veil aside with both hands. "I wish you luck. Goodbye," she said, closing the veil. But Arquette could still see her eyes through it, and they were even sweeter and more mysterious, provoking haunting thoughts. It dawned on him with a sudden certainty that he had fallen in love with her. The shock left him speechless, unable to reply to the rancher's farewell. As the car drove away, a cloud of dust rose up. Chapter 3. As Stan Arquette stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest, he watched the cloud of dust created by the departing vehicle until it vanished over the hill. He didn't question what he had just witnessed. The reality of the situation had been lingering in his mind for a year, but its significance had only just become clear to him. Everything had changed in that moment when she gazed at him, her eyes piercing through the veil before slowly closing it. She was different now. There was something about her, an elusive quality that was both perplexing and captivating. Leaning against an old crooked gatepost that he had climbed as a boy, he realized that this spot would forever hold a vivid and poignant place in his memory. Over a year ago he had laid eyes on a blue-eyed, sunny-haired girl who had unknowingly captured his heart. Upon seeing her for the second time, he knew that she was unforgettable, and the third time was the moment he realized he was in love. It was a sad and regrettable feeling, yet his inner being swelled and throbbed with emotion. Her name was Marcia Smith, and her father was one of the richest men in the state of Washington. She had a brother named Jim who had refused to wait for the army draft. Stan trembled as tears welled up in his eyes. Suddenly his life seemed unbearable. An immeasurable barrier had arisen between him and his father, a hideous thing of blood, years, and ineradicable difference. The vast acres of wheatland that he held so dear were to be taken away from him, and love had overtaken him with a headlong rush, a love that could never be returned. And cruelest of all, the war was calling him to give up his home, his father, his future, and to go out to kill or be killed. As he leaned against the gatepost, he realized that he could not allow bitterness and hatred to consume him, no matter how unfortunate his circumstances and fate. Remembering the light in Marcia Smith's eyes, he knew that he had to be incalculable to her, along with her brother Jim and many other young Americans. That thought saved Stan Arquette. He realized that there were other things besides his own career and happiness. The way he was placed, however unfortunate from a selfish point of view, must not breed a self-pitying attitude. In that moment of resolution he had a revelation of what he owed himself. He knew that the work, thought, and feeling of his last few weeks at home must be intensified. In this moment Stan knew that he had to do a lot and live greatly in a short time. He understood that many young men who made the decision to go to war had a strange spiritual division of themselves. He wondered if this moment was a letdown for them, a surrender to the brutalizing spirit of war. However, he knew it could never be that way for him, thanks to the girl who had entered his life. As he was lost in thought, the bell for the midday meal rang, and he headed back to the house. He saw the hired men coming, and 2 unknown men were with them. He recognized them as the strangers who had been speaking to Mr. Smith's driver. Jerry, a long-trusted employee, broke away from the strangers, but they followed him, arguing vehemently. The other hired men gathered around, listening. Eventually, Jerry broke away and headed towards the house while the strangers addressed the other men. The whole party disappeared behind the barn. Stan went into the house thoughtfully, intending to speak to Jerry about the strangers, but he wanted to think about it first. He had a sense of unease. His father was not in the sitting room or the kitchen, and the dinner was ready on the table. The only servant, an old woman who had been with the Arquettes for years, seemed impatient at the delay in the men's arrival. On Sundays, both father and son ate with the hired help. As Stan stepped outside, he saw Jerry washing at the bench. "Jerry, what's holding up the men?" he asked. "Well, they're chatting out there with 2 IWW guys," replied Jerry. Stan grabbed the rope of the farm bell and rang it sharply. Then he sat down at the table, and Jerry soon joined him. Old man Arquette was nowhere to be seen, which was not unusual. The other hired men didn't show up until Jerry and Stan were halfway through their meal. They appeared agitated and somewhat rowdy, Stan noticed, but once they began eating like hungry laborers, they had little to say. Stan finished his meal quickly and went outside to wait for Jerry. But Jerry took a long time to come out, and loud voices in the kitchen indicated further argument. Finally, he strolled out and started packing his pipe. "Jerry, I need to talk to you," said Stan. "Let's go somewhere else." The hired man was a large, rough-looking guy with a friendly face and honest eyes. "I suppose you want to know about those IWW guys?" he asked as they walked away. "Yes," replied Stan. "There's been a steady stream of those guys walking through the countryside for the past week or so," Jerry explained. "Today was the first time any of them came to me, but I've heard rumors. When I was in Palmer on Sunday, the air was thick with them." "Rumors about what?" asked Stan. "All sorts," Jerry replied, nonchalantly scratching his stubby beard. "There's an IWW army coming in from the east. Idaho and Montana are getting hit now. Shorter hours, double pay, join the union, sabotage, whatever that means, a capital and labor war, threats if you don't fall in line, and who knows what else." "What did those two guys want from you?" "They wanted us to join the IWW," the laborer replied. "Were they looking for work?" "Not that I heard." One of them had a thick stack of bills that could make a cow choke. He talked the most, while the little guy with the beady eyes and pockmarks barely spoke. He was Austrian and new to the country. The big guy, who called himself Stone, must be a big shot in the IWW. He seemed friendly and persuasive at first, but when I refused to join the union, he became rude and bossy. They made me angry, so I told him to go to hell. Then he said that the IWW would control the entire Northwest this summer, including wheat fields, lumbering, fruit harvesting, and railroading. He also said that any worker who refused to join would face consequences. "Well, Jerry, what do you think about this organization?" asked Stan, sounding concerned. "Not much. It's not fair. I don't believe in them. The way Stone talks and the threatening methods I've heard of are similar. If I owned a farm, I'd whip such people off. There will be trouble if they come to Bend." "Jerry, are you happy with your job?" Stan asked. "Sure. I won't join the IWW, and I'll speak against it. I guess a few of us will have to do all the harvesting, and because of that I want $1 more per day on my wages." "If my father doesn't agree to that, I will," Stan said. "Now what about the other men?" "Well, they're all leaning towards promises of less work and more pay," Jerry replied with a laugh. "Morgan is undecided about joining, but Andrew agreed. He's Dutch and stubborn. Jansen is happy to cause trouble for his boss. They're going to skip work today and talk to Stone. They agreed to meet at the culvert, and that's what they were arguing with me about, trying to get me to come." "Where's this man, Stone?" Stan asked. "I'm going to give that guy a piece of my mind," Stan muttered to himself. "I reckon he's lurking around the farm somewhere, out of sight." Turning to Jerry, one of the hired men, he said, "All right, Jerry, you go back to work. Stick with us and you won't lose anything. Keep your eyes and ears open." As Stan walked back to the house, he interrupted a conversation in the kitchen. The hired men looked down at their plates and said nothing. Stan left the sitting room door open and asked his mother if his father had come to dinner. "No, and when I called him he started roaring like a mad bull," replied Martha. Stan knocked on his father's door and was met with a thunderous roar in German. Lately his father had been speaking only German, which frustrated Stan. The two were at a deadlock, and Stan was quickly losing his patience. He pounded on the locked door and yelled, "The men are going to lay off. Who runs this farm?" His father's response was only more silence. Frustrated, Stan left the room and headed outside to find the hired men. He ordered them back to work, and they trudged off surlily toward the barn. Stan continued his search for the IWW men and eventually found them hiding behind an old straw stack. They were comfortably seated with their backs against the straw, enjoying a hearty lunch. Stan was furious and didn't care about the stranger's presence, but they didn't seem to mind. One of them was an American man, around 30 years old, with a clean-shaven face, a square jaw, and light, steely, secretive gray eyes that exuded intelligence and confidence. His outfit didn't match his demeanor, as it was a motley garb. His companion was a foreigner, small in stature, with deep pits in his sallow face and eyes like a ferret. "Do you know you're trespassing?" Stan demanded. "You begrudge us a little shade, even for a bite to eat?" replied the American, wrapping his lunch in a paper. He stood up leisurely, fixing his penetrating gaze on Stan. "That's what I heard about you rich farmers of the Bend." "What business do you have coming here?" Stan asked sharply. "You sneak around to avoid the farmers, trespassing to reach our men, and with a bunch of lies and nonsense you make them unhappy with their jobs. I'll fire these men just for listening to you." "Mr. Arquette, we want you to fire them. That's my business out here," said the American. "Who are you anyway?" "That's my business too," the American replied. Stan's emotions shifted from hot to cold as he sensed the man's hostility and threatening demeanor. "My foreman told me your name is Stone," Stan continued, now calmer. "He said you're speaking as if you're one of the leaders of the IWW, that you're not looking for a job, that you have a lot of money, that you coerce and threaten, and that you've intimidated 3 of our workers." "Your Jerry's a marked man," Stone said shortly. "You impudent scoundrel," Stan exclaimed. "Now listen to this. You're the first IWW man I've met. You look and talk like an American, but if you are, you're a traitor. We're at war, a war with a powerful country, Germany, and you come here spreading discontent in the wheat fields." As Stone threatened to mark his wheat fields, Stan wasted no time in knocking him down and standing over him, ready to defend himself against any weapon. The foreigner cowered back while Stone slowly got up, nursing a bleeding nose and a puffed-out cheek. Stan's anger boiled over as he reminded Stone of the IWW's first rule to abolish capital. The effect was immediate. Stone turned white and hurried away, followed by his companion. Stan knew that he had seen proof of the IWW's crookedness in Stone's guilty face. There was something powerful behind the IWW's cunning and assurance, and Stan sensed that it was not just the power of a new labor organization. The government was preparing for war, and any disorder could be disastrous. The IWW was taking advantage of the crisis to further its own ends, but there was something even more sinister behind Stone's actions, something that threatened not just the wheatlands of the Northwest, but something that loomed dark and nameless. With the power of a massive canine, Stan shook himself and sprang into action. He found solace and joy in the vigorous exertion which helped to alleviate his worrying tendencies. After a brief survey of the fields, he realized that only Morgan had returned to work. Andrew and Jansen were nowhere to be found. Jansen had left 4 horses hitched to a harrow, so Stan decided to take up the task that was abandoned. It was a lengthy field, and if he had received $1 for each time he had crossed it in the last decade, he would have been a wealthy man. He could have completed the task with his eyes closed. The field was fallow ground that had already been plowed, disked, and rolled. Now the final step was to harrow it, loosening the soil and preserving the moisture. Morgan, on the other side of the section, had the advantage since he had a new harrow machine that allowed him to ride while driving the horses. Stan, using an old harrow, had to walk. The 4 large horses moved at a brisk pace that required Stan to step up his game to keep up with them. It was a strenuous task to maintain a straight line, hold back on the reins, and keep up with the pace. It was a testament to Stan's character that he had followed that old harrow for miles on end. He could endure the strain, and he loved the physical and spiritual significance of the labor. As he drove west, he faced a wind full of dust as dry as powder. Every time the horse's hooves and the harrow's steel spikes hit the ground, a cloud of dust would billow up, and he had to blink rapidly to prevent being blinded. The dust's smell clogged his nostrils, and as soon as he began to sweat under the blazing sun, the dust would cake on his face, causing an itchy, stinging, and burning sensation. There was dust between his teeth. Driving back to the east brought relief as the wind whisked the dust away from him, and he could smell the fragrance of the newly turned soil. The soil looked rich and fertile, with the harrowed areas looking particularly nourished. However, the land that had not been tended looked dry and desperate for rain. The sky was hot and cloudless, with only the dusty yellow clouds as the only sign of movement. Arquette was making his way across the field when he noticed people walking in groups of 2 or 3 along the road. Although he didn't respond to their greetings, he was surprised to see anyone at all, as travelers were rare in that area. He wondered where they were going, as they all seemed to be heading towards the river coming from nearby towns and cities. In previous years, it was common to see groups of laborers passing by during the harvest season, but this year they were coming earlier and in greater numbers. Despite the dust and heat, Arquette found himself lost in thought about Marcia Smith. He couldn't shake the memory of the way she looked at him with her deep and steady gaze. He found solace in his thoughts of her, even when he was alone on the farm or serving as a soldier. She had been curious and sympathetic towards him, studying his face and listening intently to his talk about wheat. However, he had not revealed his true feelings to her until he saw the potent look in her eyes during their last meeting. As the sun set behind the distant hazy mountains, Stan Arquette toiled away at the fallow ground his laborers had left behind. He guided the horses back to their stables with a tired mind and body. Upon reaching the stables, he was informed by Morgan that his father had fired both Andrew and Jansen. Jansen, in a fit of rage, had threatened to ruin the reputation of the Arquette farm, ensuring that no one would work for them again. Stan put the horses away and retired to his attic room to change out of his damp and dusty clothes. He then joined his father for supper, determined to remain silent and understanding. Bert Arquette sat at the kitchen table, a massive man with a round, bullet-shaped head and a full beard. His face was heavy and seemed to exude dark thoughts. His eyes blazed with an intense fire, and his will was unbreakable. Stan had never felt such a great distance between himself and his father. As he ate in silence, Bert abruptly pushed his plate away and growled in German, "I fired Andrew and Jansen." "I know," replied Stan. "It wasn't a wise decision. What will we do for help?" "I'll find someone else. The harvest is coming, and we need all the help we can get," Bert replied. "But they're all part of the IWW," Stan protested. "What's that?" Stan asked his father, his anger barely contained. He proceeded to explain what the IWW was, emphasizing how treacherous the organization was to the United States. "How's that?" his father, old Arquette, grunted. Stan was hesitant to tell his father, who was not well informed about current events and did not read newspapers, that wheat would play a crucial role in the war if the Allies were to win. Instead, he warned that if the IWW caused strikes and chaos in the Northwest, it would cause problems for the government. "Then I'll hire IWW men," his father declared. Stan struggled to control his temper. This was his blind father, after all. "But I won't have IEW men on the farm," he retorted. "I just punched one IWW solicitor." "I'll run this farm. If you don't like it, you can leave," his father darkly asserted. Stan slumped back in his chair, staring at his father's bulging forehead and hard eyes. What was going on in his father's head? Had the war twisted his brain? Why were Germans so difficult? "My heavens, father, would you kick me out of my home because we disagree?" he asked, desperate. "In my country, sons have more freedom and more say. America has no sense of family life or honest government. I hate this country," his father spat. A ball of fire erupted in Stan. "That kind of talk infuriates me," he blazed. "I don't care if you're my father. Why the hell did you come to America? Why did you stay? Why did you marry my mother, an American woman? That's just spiteful rot. You've told me what life was like in Europe when you were a boy. You ran away. You stayed in this country because it was better than yours. For 50 years you've been in America, many of those years spent on this farm, and you cherish this land. My goodness, father, can't you and men like you see the truth?" I can," replied the old man gloomily. "The truth is we'll lose the land. That greedy Smith will drive me off." "He will not. He's a fine, generous man," asserted Stan earnestly. "All he wanted was to see the prospects of the harvest and perhaps to help you. Smith has not received interest on his money for 3 years. I'll bet he's paid the interest demanded by the other stockholders in that bank you borrowed from. Why, he's our friend." "Aye, and I see more," boomed the father. "He brought his daughter up here to make eyes at my son. I saw her, the sly wench. Boy, you'll not marry her." Stan choked back his mounting rage. "Certainly I never will," he said bitterly. "But I would if she'd have me." "What?" thundered Arquette, his white locks standing up and shaking like the mane of a lion. "That wheat banker's daughter, never, I forbid it. You shall not marry any American girl." "Father, this is idle, foolish rant," cried Stan with a high warning note in his voice. "I have no intention of marrying, but if I did, whom else could I marry except an American girl? I'll sell the wheat, the land, we'll go back to Germany." That was maddening to Stan. He sprang up, sending dishes crashing to the floor. He bent over to pound the table with a fist. Violent speech choked him, and he felt a cold, tight blanching of his face. "Listen," he rang out. "If I go to Germany, it'll be as a soldier to kill Germans. I'm done. I'm through with the very name. Listen to the last words I'll ever speak to you in German. The last. To hell with Germany." Then Stan plunged, blind in his passion, out of the door into the night. As he walked away, he could hear his father's cry of anguish in the distance. The night was dark and cool, with a faint breeze blowing across the hills, carrying a sweet, earthy scent. The sky was a vast, deep blue canvas, painted with countless stars. Stan stumbled along the edge of a wheat field until he reached a stack of straw bales, where he collapsed in agony. "I'm ruined, ruined," he sobbed, his body shaking with grief. "The end has come, poor old Dad." He leaned against the stack of straw, his face and body covered in a cold sweat. His anger was slowly subsiding, but his breathing was still labored, punctuated by gasps and sobs. He couldn't believe the horrible cruelty of his situation, the unutterable stupidity of his father. What had he done to deserve such a curse? But even as these thoughts raced through his mind, he knew that his anger had been righteous. His father's twisted mind was to blame for all of this, just like the twisted minds of the Germans who had caused so much destruction in the war. "By God, I am American!" he shouted into the night, as if calling out to his mother's grave on the hill. His passion had been a vortex, pulling him under and forcing him to make a decision. And now, finally, he felt free. The hell was over, and his soul was free. As his fury subsided, he fell back against the straw bales and closed his eyes. His body was weak and trembling, but his mind and will were strong, and for the first time in his life he felt like he was in control. As the hound let out a mournful bay, the insects chirped incessantly, and the night wind rustled the wheat. The young man lay there, gazing up at the twinkling stars in the sky and the shadows of the hills in the dusk. The night was lonely, sad, and yet mystic. Suddenly he felt a source of strength, a revelation that uplifted him. He knew he was not to blame for what had happened and that he couldn't change the future. He had two choices, to be a man or a coward. He chose to be a man. He felt a spirit beside him, maybe his mother or someone who loved him, urging him to be true to his ideals and even die for them if necessary. This night was unlike any other in his life. The hills with their rustling wheat meant more than words could describe. He wondered where the wheat had come from, who had sowed the first and original seeds. The stars and the dark blue of the sky hid the secret, but beyond them there must be an answer, and perhaps peace. Material things like life and success, which had inspired Stan Arquette, lost their significance on this calm night. They could not last, but the wheat, the hills, and the stars would go on with their task. Passion was a dominant side of a man, a matter of inheritance, but self-sacrifice, with its mercy, its succor, and its seed like the wheat, was infinite like the stars. He had already made up his mind, but he knew that was not enough. The world was full of little men, but he refused to stay little. The war had created a rift between Stan and his father, born out of the selfish desires of their own minds. While his father's actions could be forgiven due to his blindness, there were others who were suffering needlessly. The pain of the sick, crippled, and idle could be eased, and the suffering of women and children could be prevented if people were honest and true. Initially, Stan saw his love for a blue-eyed girl as a calamity, but as he stood under the stars in the midst of the whispering wheat, he realized it was a blessing. He desired nothing more than to serve, whether it be his country, his future, or the girl he loved. Suddenly he found himself with a newfound sense of purpose, a chance to achieve greatness. But he knew that his focus should not be on fleeting pleasures like kissing the girl he loved. Instead, he had to concern himself with her future and what he could do to ensure it was bright. Stan had to give up the life he had always known, the freedom, the hope, and the possibility of achievement, to answer the call of war. It was a sacrifice he had to make, even if he had never met Marcia Smith. However, the pain of losing, getting shot or stabbed, and the fear of dying couldn't compare to the image of an American girl in my mind. She had blue eyes, red lips, and golden hair, and I imagined her walking down a summer path or through a blooming orchard on land that was free. Chapter 4. In late July, eastern Washington was hit with the most scorching heat ever recorded. The area was known for having a pleasant climate with mild winters and cool summers. However, this wave of heat was unlike anything the locals had experienced before. The only saving grace was the lack of humidity in the air. The heat haze that hung over the area resembled thin smoke from distant forest fires. The sun rose as a great pale red ball, hot and intense from the beginning of the day. It blazed white-hot at noon and slowly made its way westward through a cloudless, coppery sky. Finally, it would set sullen and crimson over the ranges. Spokane, the only center of iron, steel, brick, and masonry in the area, looked like a city of furnaces. Business was at a standstill, with the asphalt on the streets leaving clean imprints of a pedestrian's feet and bits of newspaper sticking fast to the hot tar. Down by the gorge, where the great green river made its magnificent plunges over the falls, people gathered and lingered. They were loath to leave, as the blowing mist and the air set into motion by the falling water created a temperature that offered some relief from the oppressive heat. Citizens talked of the protracted hot spell, the blasted crops, the almost certain disaster to the wheat fields, and the activities of the IWWW. Even the war, for the time being, gave way to the impending calamities closer to home. Montana had taken drastic measures against the invading IWW. The governor of Idaho had sent word to the camps of the organization that they had 5 days to leave the state. Spokane was waking up to the menace of hordes of strange, idle men who came in on the westbound freight trains. The railroads were struggling to keep up with the situation at hand. They were finding it difficult to run trains at all. Train crews who refused to join the IWW were being threatened, beaten, shot at, and otherwise intimidated. The Chamber of Commerce urgently appealed to representative wheat raisers, ranchers, lumbermen, and farmers to discuss the situation in Spokane. They all convened at the Hotel Davenport, where they were served lunch in one of the most magnificent dining halls in the West. Riesenberg, a man of German descent but with all-American sympathies, was the lion of this group of Spokane capitalists. He was the president of a city bank and the Chamber of Commerce. Riesenberg addressed the large assembly of clean-cut, square-jawed, intent-eyed Westerners with these words: "Gentlemen, we are here to discuss the most threatening and unfortunate situation the Northwest was ever called upon to meet." His speech was not lengthy, but it was powerful. The Chamber of Commerce had unlimited resources and could influence and control the state government. But it was the visitors invited to the meeting, the men of the outlying districts that were threatened, who would provide the objective proof and the best methods of procedure. The first facts revealed were that many crops were already ruined, but due to the increased acreage that year, a fair yield was still expected. Wheat in the Bend would be a failure, though some farmers here and there would harvest well. The lumber districts were not operating due to the IWW. It was at this point that the Industrial Workers of the World, the organization of men who called themselves the IWW, drew the attention of the meeting. The depredations already committed had stunned the members of the Chamber of Commerce. President Riesenberg then called upon Beardsley, a prominent and intelligent rancher from the southern wheat belt. The eruption of the IWW is nothing short of a rebellion, and the best way to handle such a situation is through direct action. These IWW folks don't believe in peaceful protests or the ballot box. They prefer to burn crops, destroy lumber, and blow up freight trains to get their message across. They thrive on threats and intimidation, not logical argument. Some Western towns are considering deporting these rebels, but that's too lenient. In the old days, they would have been hung or shot. We're not suggesting we go back to those barbaric methods, but perhaps internment could be an option. The British have put German prisoners to work, so why can't we do the same with our rebel IWWs? Jones, a farmer from Yakima Valley, shared that everyone, from business people to high school students, was willing to help save Washington's crops in case of labor trouble. They had already mobilized workers in stores, offices, and homes to work in the fields, and many had signed pledges to work a certain number of days. Helmar, a lumberman from the Blue Mountains, also spoke up. His company owned a lot of timbered land and purchased timber from the state and individuals. Our logging operations have come to a screeching halt due to the actions of a group calling themselves the Industrial Workers of the World, along with other troublemakers who support them. They've been threatening our employees with physical harm and death, causing them to fear for their safety. These individuals have set up camp in the forests around our works, picketing and intimidating anyone who tries to enter or leave. They've even gone so far as to openly declare that they will burn down our works, logs, and timber, and have encouraged others to sabotage our efforts. Their ultimate goal is to bring the entire lumbering industry to its knees, destroying property and intimidating laborers who are willing to work. They've made it clear that they won't stop until they've paralyzed the industry completely. We face a very real and immediate threat to our property, and we desperately need protection. Our lawful operations have been disrupted, and our employees are too afraid to work. These troublemakers have even gone as far as to threaten our camps and the men working in them, warning them to stop or face the consequences. To make matters worse, the dry season has made the woods a tinderbox, and the threat of catastrophic fires looms over us. The industrial workers of the world and their supporters have openly declared that they will burn everything to the ground rather than let us continue our work. We've brought this to the attention of the local sheriff, but unless action is taken, we fear that our property will be destroyed and our livelihoods will be ruined. Numerous members of an organization have set up camp in the timbered area, and their presence poses a fire hazard. They are not engaged in any business except to interfere with the logging industry and the work of this company and others in the same business. We have made every effort to continue our operations and protect our employees in a lawful manner. However, we are now powerless and place the responsibility for safeguarding our property and employees on the County Board of Commissioners and county officials. Next, President Riesenberg asked a young journalist to read some paragraphs from an IWW speech he had heard delivered to a gathering of 300 workers. It was noteworthy that a few members of the Chamber of Commerce requested a specific paragraph to be read again. It was this: "If you working men could only unite, you could do in this country what has been done in Russia," declared the IWW speaker. "You know what the working men did there to the slimy curs, the gunmen, and the stool pigeons of the capitalistic class? They bumped them off. They sent them up to say, 'Good morning, Jesus.'" After a moment of murmurs and another pause, the president resumed the meeting. "Gentlemen, we have Smith of Golden Valley with us today. If any of you are unfamiliar with him, you have undoubtedly heard of him. His ancestors were pioneers, and he was born in Washington. He is a representative of the men who have developed the Northwest. He fought the Indians in the early days and carried a gun for the outlaws. Today, gentlemen, he owns a farm as big as Spokane County. We want to hear from him." When Smith stood up to speak, it was evident that he was pale and serious. With a slow and steady gaze, Smith surveyed the group of men waiting before him. He bowed, then began to speak with a commanding tone. "Gentlemen and friends, I hate to be the one to disrupt this campfire chatter, but I must. You all have been talking about the IWW, and the facts have been presented that show a sudden and strange growth of this labor union. We've had dealings with them for years, but this year is different. They've multiplied and strengthened. There's something behind them, a big unseen hand stacking the deck, and that tremendous power is German gold." Smith's voice boomed like a bell, yet his listeners remained silent. No surprise showed, but their faces grew stern and resolute. After a pause of suspense in which Smith's words had time to sink in, he resumed his speech. "A few weeks ago, a young man, a stranger, came to me and asked for a job. He claimed he could do anything, so I hired him to drive my car. However, he was not a very good driver. One day we went up to the Bend country, and during that trip I became suspicious of him. I caught him talking to what I believed were IWW men. When we returned home, I kept an eye on him and listened carefully. It didn't take me long to discover discontent among my farm hands, which was unusual. I hire about 100 hands on my ranches during the long off-season, and when harvest comes around, I need even more. But they were quitting, and I attributed it to that driver." Smith continued, "Not long ago I saw him consorting with the same strange man I had seen him talking to on the Bend trip. But my driver, Johnson, didn't see me. That night I put a cowboy to watch him, and what the cowboy heard when put together was that Johnson was an assistant to an IWW leader named Stone. He had summoned Stone to come and survey my ranch. These two IWW men had more money than they could carry. A lot of it was gold. The way they spoke of their wealth showed that they were unaware of its origin, but the supply was endless. The next day Stone was nowhere to be found. However, my cowboy had learned enough to reveal their tactics. If these recruiters couldn't persuade or frighten trusted individuals to join the IWW, they attempted to bribe them with money, and in most cases they succeeded. I haven't yet sprung anything on my driver Johnson, but he can't escape, and while he's here I'll learn a lot by observing him. Perhaps through Johnson I can apprehend Stone. And so, gentlemen, we have a straightforward case. And the threat is enough to send shivers down the spine of every patriotic citizen. Any way you look at it, if harvests can't be harvested, if wheat fields and lumber forests are burned, if the state militia has to be summoned, any way you look at it, our government will be impeded, our supplies will be withheld from our allies, and the cause of Germany will be bolstered. The IWW have an organized power behind them with a clear motive. There can hardly be any doubt that this power is Germany. The agitators and leaders throughout the country are well compensated. They likely do not know who pays them as individuals. A small group of men undoubtedly makes the deals and manages the money. We read that every U.S. attorney is investigating the IWW. The government has decided to act against them. However, lawyers and the law are sluggish to act. Meanwhile, the threat to us is imminent. Gentlemen, to conclude, let me say that in my neck of the woods we're going to confront the IWW in the traditional Western way. Chapter 5. Its rolling hills and lush greenery were a sight to behold, and the cattle that grazed there were some of the finest in the land. The air was fresh and clean, and the people who lived there were hardworking and honest. One day a stranger rode into town. He was a tall man with a weather-beaten face and a quiet demeanor. He didn't say much, but the people of Golden Valley could tell that he was a man of few words. The stranger soon made his way to the local saloon, where he ordered a whiskey and sat down at a table in the corner. He didn't seem interested in making conversation, but the other patrons couldn't help but be curious about the new arrival. As the night wore on, the stranger's reputation grew. Some said that he was a gunslinger, while others claimed that he was a lawman, but no one knew for sure. The next day, the stranger was seen riding out of town. No one knew where he was headed, but they all agreed that he was a mysterious and intriguing figure. Years later, a group of cowboys were driving a herd of cattle through the Northwest when they came across a man sitting alone by a campfire. It was the stranger from Golden Valley. He didn't say much, but the cowboys could tell that he was a man of few words. They asked him if he wanted to join them on their journey, and he agreed. For weeks, the stranger rode alongside the cowboys, helping them drive the cattle and sharing stories around the campfire at night. But eventually the time came for him to move on. As he rode away, the cowboys couldn't help but wonder about the mysterious stranger from Golden Valley. They knew that they would never forget him, or the sense of mystery that he brought with him wherever he went. The southern slope of the Blue Mountains rose high, and from there countless brooks flowed down and merged to form streams and rivers that generously irrigated the valley. The vast black timberland stretched down to the grazing uplands which bordered on the rolling golden wheat fields. These fields contrasted sharply with the lower green alfalfa pastures, followed by the orchards with their ripe red fruit. Lastly, the bottomlands with their vegetable gardens proved the richness of the soil. From the mountainside, the valley appeared as a series of colored benches, stepping down from black to gray, gray to gold, and gold to green with a purple tinge. The perfectly ordered, many-hued floor had countless winding, tree-bordered streams glinting in the sunlight. Golden Valley never experienced extreme heat or cold. Spokane and the Bend country might have been in the Sahara, for all the effect their torrid zone had on this garden spot of the inland empire. The valley was hot, but not unpleasant, and its greatest charm was its pleasant climate all year round. No summer cyclones, winter blizzards, cloudbursts, or bad thunderstorms ever visited the valley. Once lived in, this country could never be left. The great area of 2,500 miles had no poor inhabitants, and many were rich. The valley floor had prosperous little towns, and the many smooth, dusty, much-used roads all led to Triton, a wealthy and fine city. Smith, the rancher, had driven his car to Spokane and returned with a detective whom he intended to use in the IWW investigations and a neighbor rancher. They had left Spokane early and endured almost insufferable dust and heat. A welcome change began as they slid down from the bare desert into the valley. Once across the Copper River, Smith began to breathe easier and feel like he was nearing home. "Man, this is God's country," exclaimed Smith as he drove up the first hill, feeling the cool breeze from the nearby forest. Though there was still dust in the air, it was different. It smelled like apples and alfalfa. The roads were well maintained, and Smith drove his car for miles and miles through a beautiful, fragrant landscape. He passed by streams and hamlets, all shining white in the sunlight. When he reached Huntington, he dropped off his neighbor and a detective who was going undercover to investigate the IWW. He continued on for another 40 miles until he reached his own property. Smith owned a number of farms and ranches that stretched from the bottomlands to the timberline of the mountains. He had worked hard to accumulate all this land and had always been fair in his dealings. Some of the orchards and vegetable lands he rented out to tenant farmers. The uplands where he grew wheat and grass he managed himself. As he acquired more property, he moved from place to place until he finally built a permanent home higher up in the valley. The house was modern, with a white exterior and a red roof. It sat on a high bench with golden fields sloping up from it and green squares of alfalfa and orchards below. It was visible from Vale, the nearest town 5 miles away. Smith loved the outdoors and wanted a place where he could watch the sun rise and set over the valley and mountains. He could sit on his wide, shady front porch and look over his 2,000 acres of land. From the back porch he could see even more of his broad, swelling slopes of grain and grass. As he drove up the main road, Smith turned right towards the house. A cluster of barns, sheds, corrals, granaries, engine and machinery houses, a store and the homes of hired men formed a little village under a wooded slope. The sounds of the rushing water, the pounding of hoofs on the barn floor, the shrill whistle of a stallion, the drawling laugh of the cowboys, and the clinking of their spurs welcomed him as he stopped his car in the big courtyard. Among those who hurried to meet him was Johnson, the suspected driver. Smith's keen glance made note of the driver's worried and anxious face. "Johnson, she'll need a looking over," he said as he uncovered bundles in the back seat and lifted them out. "All right, sir," replied Johnson eagerly. A note of ended strain was significant in his voice. "Here you, Jake," cheerily called Smith to a raw-boned, gaunt-faced cowboy. "Boss, I'm powerful glad to see you home," replied Jake as he received bundle after bundle until he was loaded down. Then he grinned. "Maybe you want a pack hoss?" "You're hoss enough for me. Come on," he said. And waving the other men aside, he turned towards the green, shady hill above which the red and white of the house just showed. A bridge crossed the rushing stream. Here Jake dropped some of the bundles, and Smith recovered them. As he straightened up, he looked searchingly at the cowboy. Jake's yellow-gray eyes returned the gaze, and that exchange showed these two of the same breed and sure of each other. "Nothin' come off, boss," he drawled, "but I'm glad you're home." "Did Johnson leave the place?" queried Smith. "Twice at night, and he was gone long. I didn't follow him because I saw he didn't take any luggage, and that boy has some fancy clothes. He was definitely coming back," said one of the ranch hands. "Any sign of his partner, Stone?" asked the rancher. "Nope, but there have been a few new guys snooping around," replied the ranch hand. "Have you heard from any of the boys with the cattle?" questioned the rancher. "Yep, Bill Weeks rode down and said a bunch of IWWs were camping above Blue Spring. That means they've moved down to the edge of the timber and are uncomfortably close to our wheat. Bill says they're killing our stock for meat," explained the ranch hand. "How many in the gang?" inquired the rancher darkly. He had had previous dealings with outlaw rustlers and wasn't fond of losing a single steer. "Well, I reckon we can't say. Maybe 500, counting all along the valley on this side. Then we hear there's more on the other. Boss, if they get ugly, we're going to lose stock, wheat, and maybe some blood," warned Jake, the ranch hand. "So many as that?" exclaimed the rancher in amazement. "They come and go, and lately they're mostly coming," replied Jake. "When do we begin cutting grain?" "I reckon tomorrow. Adams didn't want to start until you got back. It'll be barley and oats for a few days, and then wheat if we can get the men," answered the rancher. "And has Adams hired any?" asked the rancher. "Yes, around 20 or so. They swore they weren't IWWs, but Adams says, and so do I, that some of them are men who first claimed to our old hands that they did belong to the IWW," answered Jake. "So we've got to take a chance if we're going to harvest 2,000 acres of wheat?" questioned the rancher. "I reckon, boss," replied Jake. "Any reports from Triton Way?" inquired the rancher. "Well, yes, but I reckon you'd better get your supper before I tell you, boss," said Jake. "Jake, you said nothing had come off," reminded the rancher. "Well, nothing has around here. Come on now, boss. Miss Marcia says I was to keep my mouth shut," said Jake. "Jake, who's your boss? Me or Marcia?" asked the rancher. "Well, you are," replied Jake. "I ain't disobeying Miss Marcia," said Jake. Smith continued up the shaded path towards the bright white house, the setting sun illuminating its beauty. The barking of dogs and pattering of feet signaled the arrival of Smith to his daughters. Kathleen, 10 years old, ran towards him while Rose, 14, followed closely behind. Both girls were ecstatic, and their hair danced in the sun. Marcia, Smith's wife, waited for him at the steps. As he climbed the porch with his 3 daughters, his wife smiled anxiously, making the welcome home as perfect as possible. However, Smith's joy was bittersweet without his only son. "Dad, what did you bring me?" cried Kathleen, leaving her father for the bundle-laden Jake. "Me too," echoed Rose. Even Marcia couldn't resist the excitement of the many bundles. They all went inside to a cozy living room through a hall. Mrs. Smith's first words after welcoming her husband were, "Any news of Jim?" "Well, yes," replied Smith hesitantly. Suddenly the 3 sisters were silent. They all looked so much alike, Marcia blossoming into a woman, Rose blossoming into a young girl, and Kathleen a rosy, radiant child. Marcia lost a bit of her bloom. "What news, Father?" she asked. "Haven't you heard from him?" Smith returned. "Not for a whole week. He wrote the day he reached Spokane, but then he hardly knew anything except that he enlisted." "I'm glad Jim didn't wait for the draft," replied the father. "Well, Mother and girls, Jim was gone when I got to Spokane. All I heard was that he was well when he left for Frisco and strong for the aviation corps." "Then he means to be an aviator," said Marcia, her lips quivering. "Yeah, as long as he's got the skills. Jim's a real whiz with engines and machinery, and he's got nerves of steel. He's going to be an amazing pilot," said Smith confidently. "But what about the danger?" whispered Jim's mother, visibly worried. "Well, there's always a little danger involved, but we gotta trust Jim. Besides, if he stayed home, he'd be fighting the IWW. The tense moment passed as Mrs. Smith went to prepare supper and the younger girls started unpacking. Marcia studied her father's face and decided to send the waiting cowboy, Jake, away until after supper. "I'm just tired, not worried," reassured Smith as Jake left with a jingle of spurs. Marcia asked about his trip to Spokane and if anything serious had happened. "No, but the men there are anticipating trouble," replied Smith. "I had a busy schedule, including a meeting with the Chamber of Commerce and a government official from Washington who was curious about the Ben's loyalty to the U.S. But this is home. I'd rather die here than live in Spokane during the summer." Marcia reminded her father of the one American they had met in the Bend, and he was intrigued. "That's right. Oh, and there was a government official who wanted to talk to me about the Ben's loyalty to the U.S. I gave him my honest opinion. He said he was going to drive through the wheat belt and talk to Americans he could find," Smith said, "and impress upon them that they could do as much as soldiers to win the war. Wheat bread, that's our great gun in this war, Marcia. I knew this, but I was made pretty sober by that government man. I told him by all means to go to Palmer and to have a talk with young Arquette. I sure gave that boy a good word. Poor lad, he's true blue. And to think of him with that old German devil. Old Arquette has always had a hard name, and this war has brought out the German cussedness." "Father, I'm glad you spoke well of the young man," said Marcia, still in a dreamy state. You never told me what you thought," replied her father, giving her a quick glance of inquiry. Marcia was gazing out of the window, away across the wheat fields and the range. Smith watched her for a moment before he continued. "If I can get away, I'm going to drive up to see Arquette again pretty soon. Do you want to go?" Marcia gave a little start, as if the question had surprised her. "I hardly think so," she replied. "That's just as well," he said. "That'll be a hard ride. Guess I'll clean up a little for supper." Smith left the room, and while Kathleen and Rose gleefully squabbled over the bundles, Marcia continued to gaze dreamily out of the window. That night she went to her room early, despite the presence of some young people from a neighboring village. She locked her door and sat in the dark beside her open window. An early moon silvered the long slopes of wheat and made the alfalfa squares seem black. A cool, faint, sweet breeze fanned her cheek, and she could smell the fragrance of apples, of new-mown hay. She could hear the low murmur of running water, and a hound bayed off somewhere in the fields. The scene was quiet and beautiful, with wide acres of many waters stretching out before Marcia. Moonlight illuminated the serene landscape, but it did not bring her comfort. She could not shake the doubt about the sincerity of what she saw. The dark mountains beyond the silver slopes hinted at the hideous war that had stretched out a red hand to her country. Her brother had left to fight, and there was no telling if he would ever come back. Evil forces were at work out there in the moonlight. Marcia's father had asked her to ride to the Bend country, causing a strange little shock of surprise. Here in the darkness and silence, watching the crescent moon slowly sink, she thought deeply. She remembered the first time she had seen young Arquette, and still more vividly the second time, but the third time seemed both clear and vague. Marcia had been approached by many young men, but their easy-come, easy-go attractions had repelled her. However, Arquette's manner had struck her as both confusing and unforgettable. She was interested in why that was so. It was confusing to discover that she could not lay it to the sympathy she had felt for an American boy in a difficult position, because she had often thought of him long before she had any idea who he was or where he lived. From the moment she laid eyes on him, he had left a lasting impression on her. He was the embodiment of the type of young man she had always dreamed of, tall, blond, and strong, with a handsome face and piercing blue eyes. Despite her initial infatuation, it wasn't until later that she began to feel a sense of sympathy for him. As she reflected on their meeting in the wheat fields, Marcia couldn't help but acknowledge the truth. Arquette had fallen in love with her. Her intelligence told her it was impossible, but her intuition couldn't deny it. To her surprise, she found herself wanting to see him again, despite having barely gotten to know him. The idea of love at first sight seemed absurd to Marcia, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something between them. It wasn't just pity for his difficult situation. There was a connection that she couldn't explain. As she gazed out over the fields, Marcia whispered her amazement and doubt to herself. But even as she did, she felt the mysterious pull of this young man who had captured her heart.